In this chapter, Glicken takes us on a brief tour of the social work interventions and services that are provided to members of the military. As I begin this talk, I have to tip my hat because I know that a number of the students in this class are soldiers, family members of soldiers connected to JBER in Anchorage and or other places around the United States. And in fact, I know that from time to time, including I believe this particular class, we have students who are mental health technicians in the military, and so I am not sure that I'm the person who ought to be doing this particular lecture. This is not an area of expertise for me. Workers in my agency who have worked in Anchorage have had the opportunity to interact with members on the base at Fort Richardson and Elmendorf over the years, and so are more exposed to this. I've had some coworkers also who were hired as professionals, civilian social workers and civilian mental health professionals by the military in Anchorage as well. But nonetheless, I'm the person who is leading this class, and so I'm going to have to tell you a little bit about what I learned and what I know, and we'll refer you really to the discussion board responses if that might also give you some better instruction about this particular topic. But the military certainly is an area where we need to keep our focus and really understand some of the particular nature of the issues that members of the military and members of the military's families experience, particularly in a time of war, but really at any time in the course of our history. Social workers have been involved in the military, at least according to one study, since really just after World War I or during World War I. And the Veterans Administration, which we'll talk about later in this particular talk, actually I think stretches back quite a ways. Veterans have been getting federal services since I think the Civil War days, and perhaps even before then. And it's always been, if you've taken Social Work 106 with me, you know that Veterans Services is one of those areas where there's much less stigma associated, not entirely no stigma, but much less stigma associated with the benefits that are available to veterans than with other federal benefits that individuals receive through other kinds of assistance programs such as public welfare. The reason for this is because services to veterans are seen as compensation, and so there's less of a negative kind of attitude attached to people who are drawing services through the Veterans Administration. And again, not to say that there aren't some, because there certainly are, but it's a reduced level. I think the Veterans Administration and veterans hospitals, if I remember the history correctly, and large-scale interventions by the federal government really began after World War I. We talked about post-traumatic stress disorder when we covered chapter 18, and that being a diagnosis that became popular, during the Vietnam era as the thing that soldiers were experiencing, having come back from that experience. When you stretch back into World War I, post-traumatic stress disorder was called shell shock. World War II, I believe the term that was used was battle fatigue. I'm pretty sure I don't have them mixed up. I think that's the correct thing. So by World War II, PTSD was being known as battle fatigue. And I know one member of my own family, in fact, an uncle of mine who really never, I think, recovered, probably never had successful treatment that really understood what was going on with him anyway. May have had some other problems associated with it that made it more complicated, but it really did impact him for the remainder of his life. And so things like post-traumatic stress disorder, they are real things, and it's something that the social workers need to be very aware of. Social workers have been enlisted in the military services, and there's some particular problems associated with being enlisted and treating individuals in the military. There are also civilian hirees since the Second World War, so that as a civilian you can be hired by the military and provide services on base for for veterans and their families. Social workers in the military focus on improving conditions that cause social problems such as drug and alcohol abuse, racism, and sexism, and many other things as well. The Department of Defense listed a number of different kinds of things that the social work in the military does to sustain military readiness by enhancing the quality of service members and their families and units. And here are some of the services that the Department of Defense identifies for social workers, including counseling military personnel and their family, and identifying problems, identifying solutions, planning social action programs, monitoring equal opportunity programs, conducting research, and organizing community activities on a military basis. A wide variety of interventions. Some people believe that the work that social workers do in the military to reunify soldiers with their families when returning from deployment, for instance, is one of the most important things that they can do. And as I think we know, if we again if we read the papers and we stay current with events, that sometimes returning soldiers from combat areas in particular, and this can be true for any individual returning from a long absence from home, whether they're deployed even in peacetime, but certainly those soldiers returning from combat duties have some oftentimes major issues in readjusting to life in with the family and back in civilian surroundings and things like that. And so you'll find sometimes some particular problems with for those individuals when they return, and there's a big role for social work in treating that and trying to help those individuals through that. My understanding, my impression, what I've read, I would like to think this is changing, but I'm not convinced that it is yet. But that you know sort of a little bit like when we talked about first responders having to kind of close up emotions and not respond to the kinds of things they see like a person normally would, because that enables them to perform their duties. Members of the military going into combat and in combat situations have to be trained, I think, to be pretty much do the same, to turn off a lot of those prohibitions we have that we've been raised with, and to not respond to the kind of things that they might be exposed to in battle and combat situations in a way that typically we would respond. And so coming back to an environment that, for instance, with a spouse that expects you to respond as he or she had always responded, for instance, or the children making emotional demands on the parent, and those kinds of things can really result in a lot of difficulty. And while counseling services are put in place, or should be put in place at least for those individuals, I believe, again, this is what I've read, that there's something of a coda among military that you really don't need help, and that among soldiers that you really don't need help, that you should be able to tackle things and handle things on your own. And so there is sort of there's a bit of a atmosphere that turns those individuals away from seeking help when they get back, when they really most need it. And it was my understanding that the military was supposed to be trying to address that as veterans were beginning to return from combat situations, and to try to normalize the situation of seeking counseling and help more so than it had in the past. But how successful that's been, I don't know. But I believe that we would find that veterans, particularly coming from combat situations, may be resistant to emotional interventions. But nonetheless, as you see here, the social work provides a number of different counseling services and support groups and different kinds of things. Now, also, as this points out, more women are really serving in war zones, and that creates a whole new level of anxiety and a whole new set of problems that we have yet to really fully understand, I think, in terms of the best way to intervene in those situations. Certainly marriages have difficulties when, at least can have difficulties when one spouse returns from a deployment, again, whether in peacetime or wartime. My own family, and this is an experience, I think, sort of slope workers, where my father, working for the railway mill service way long time ago, was week on, week off, and so half of my life I had one parent in the home, and we functioned very successfully without our father. And in fact, I can remember times when Dad would come back that I would feel pretty much like, we've been doing good without him. And I think, what happened, of course, is that, when you're gone for longer periods of time, sometimes the family actually does kind of find a way to function without the individual. And so when that veteran returns, it can be very stressful for the family to readjust and to have two parents again, and when the family may feel like they're functioning very well without him or her. Now, that's not always the case, and is not the situation in every situation, but it's not an uncommon problem, as I understand it, for individuals returning from a deployment. So you see here that some of the services that provided military, including dealing with post-traumatic stress issues, evaluating, treating, and drug and alcohol problems, which also can be a source of quite a bit of difficulty for veterans. Working with the wounded and disabled and helping them find housing and other basic kinds of accommodations. Uh, Work again, dealing with PTSD, not only with the events that you see, but also the loss of friends and persons that you become very, very close to in the combat zones and so on. Also, it mentions also working with soldiers who have committed military or legal offenses and are incarcerated for one way or another, getting dishonorable discharges because of their behavior. Lundberg and Dolgoff, there's a definition for a dilemma here that says it's a problem situation or predicament which seems to defy a satisfactory solution because the decision maker must choose between two options of near or equal value. In other words, the dilemma is which is better than the other. And with social workers in the military, and I think particularly here they're talking about enlisted workers. There are four specific ethical dilemmas that they talk about here that are peculiar to working as an enlisted military social worker, that they can be performed to perform a task that not by somebody other than their supervisor, and perhaps somebody not trained in the field, that they're held responsible to follow those orders, that they have to work within the boundaries of military law and civilian law as well, and you can't just quit your job because you're unhappy with it anymore. And so there are particular problems with enlisted social work services that one needs to consider before entering the field. Here is just a kind of a brief overview, and this is very brief, and this chapter in no way, shape, or form can begin to effectively address the kinds of things that need to be addressed if you're going to study the treatment of members of the military and their families. But here are 5 stages in deployment and some of the particular problems that develop in each of these stages. And you can see really from the time of warning of deployment, which pre-deployment is in many respects is it's I'm sure much of a military member's existence, because isn't it true that we never really know when one might get called up? I mean, there are some reasonable expectations perhaps, but you never really know. And so I suppose in a sense that a family is always in a state of alert for deployment, and you can imagine the kinds of difficulties that are engendered because of that kind of anxiety. And here with each of these stages, there are some particular kinds of issues that come up during each stage. For the military man himself, that disorientation and loneliness at first deployment, that kind of settles into more of a sense of control after the individual's been deployed for a period of time. But back home, the family may or may not begin to experience some particular problems depending upon how the family has been put together. And then being redeployed, being told it's time to go back home, the kinds of mix of emotions that both the military member as well as the family might be experiencing while they're excited and to see each other and may have high expectations. Those expectations sometimes may not be realistic and can result in some disappointment and unhappiness when the soldier returns from deployment. Pincus describes the post-deployment period, which is 3 to 6 months from arrival and 3 to 6 months thereafter, as the most important stage that may require counseling if the soldier is to be successfully reintegrated into his or her family life and community life. A few slides about the Veterans Administration. This says the Veterans Bureau was established in June of 1926 with 14 social workers. I really not sure where that date comes from, because I do know that services to veterans preceded, but this may be what eventually evolved into the Veterans Administration, I think, in 1926. But services really began before 1926 for veterans. And while originally there was a focus upon psychiatric and tuberculosis, which is a bigger issue in the early 1900s, it's evolved into other kinds of things, as you can see here, that involve many other services across the lifespan of the family, in fact. But the intent of the VA is to provide benefits and services to veterans and their families in a responsive, timely, and compassionate manner in recognition of their service to the nation. I suspect probably some members of the military may chuckle about those adjectives. I don't know, because the VA, being a very huge organization, really doesn't fulfill its mission very well all the time, and you'll often hear a lot of criticism about how it's not really responsive to veterans' needs. It's inefficient, that it's slow to respond, that kind of thing. And in fact, the Veterans Administration, in fact, was the organization that first believed the soldiers coming back from the Vietnam War were experiencing a form of schizophrenia and didn't recognize post-traumatic stress disorder, even though, as I told you earlier, variations of that were seen in soldiers coming back from prior hostile conflicts. And so there's just a lot of criticisms with the VA that it's too bureaucratic and its treatment modes are outdated and those kinds of things. And there have been a few incidents that probably suggest or encourage those ideas, including the whole Agent Orange controversy. There was a defoliant that was used that wound up being poisonous, and it was many years before the VA recognized that Vietnam veterans were experiencing experiencing the debilitating after effects of Agent Orange exposure, and denied benefits, disability benefits, for a long time. I suspect probably because once they realized how overwhelming it might be and how big of a financial burden it was going to be to the government. And it just was that resistance to acknowledging that for a long time that really lost it a lot of favor with veterans. And then following the Gulf War, there's been a number of illnesses that we've referred to as the Gulf War syndrome, that the VA, again, is just not responded to very well. At least historically, there's a resistance to taking responsibility for really effectively and compassionately responding to the needs of soldiers when they return. I have read somewhere, and whether this is the Veterans Administration or another organization associated with the military, but that there has, with in the Iraq conflict in particular, I believe the most recent Iraq conflict, that the military was choosing to classify some of the difficulties they were having with soldiers that probably were PTSD symptoms, but choosing to classify them as behavioral issues and dishonorably discharging soldiers, rather than treating them as emotional and mental health issues resulting from their exposure to their combat situations. And my understanding is that the result of that is that the federal government had less responsibility to those soldiers later on, as far as disability payments and providing services and those kinds of things, particularly with the dishonorable discharge. Now, again, these are things that I'm reading about, and I don't have firsthand involvement in this. I can just relate to you the things that I've been told, but these are some of the things that I think reflect negatively upon the structure around the Veterans Administration and how the military handles and takes care of its soldiers when they come back from a combat situation. A lot of politics, as this slide points out, involved in that. Finally, this is the last slide in this particular lecture, and these are the kinds of things that the social workers, whether civilian or military, some of the services they perform to veterans with problems and concerns, including assessment, crisis intervention, high-risk screening, discharge planning, case management, advocacy, education, and psychotherapy. There are just a broad range of services that this profession engages in treating members of the military and military families, and I believe there's a significant role for individuals in mental health and social work services in the successful treatment of these individuals. So this is a rather short lecture and a short chapter in this particular topic. I'm sure that many of you may have some other things to add to this, so I'll look forward to seeing what people have to say in discussion boards as well. Thanks for listening. More later.